Hello YouTube, hope you're having a great day today. Today I want to take a look at reviewing the first thing that was ever written by one of the most awarded writers of all time, Fritz Leiber, in sort of the science fiction, horror, and fantasy sort of genre. So we're going to take a look at the first story he ever published, Tucson Adventure, which is, and also the more modern name that's published in Jewels in the Forest. And take a look at that, do a quick review of that, talk about who Fritz Leiber was, and such. And at the end, give you an opportunity to talk about what you thought of it, and let me know in the comments below. So that's the plan for today. So let's go ahead and get started. Who's Fritz Leiber? As a reminder, Fritz Leiber is one of the giants of writing in sort of the science and science fiction, fantasy, and horror genres. He wrote in all three. He won awards in all three. He started writing in the 30s, and he actually was writing all the way till he died in 92. So he has things that are written in every decade from the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. So he is a very, very prolific writer. So we're going to talk about Fritz Leiber here in a little bit. I have the series that this is the first story of the Fafhrd and Grey Mouser series, which I've talked about before. It's one of my top 10 fantasy works of all time. So I'm going to link to you that in the video below, so you can take a look at that and say, okay, where do I think this one stands and so forth. But this is the first of the stories set in it. It's also the first story that Leiber wrote. Leiber was one of the sort of, and probably the last one to publish, of the sort of protégés to H.P. Lovecraft. He loved Lovecraft, so he sought out Lovecraft. And Lovecraft, with Leiber, like he did with a lot of the people that he wrote with, he really developed a relationship with the person who wrote these big giant letters. Both of them were strong epistolarians who loved writing letters and such. Leiber himself wrote to Lovecraft, and Lovecraft looked at some of his earlier works before they were published, helped him to work on coming up with his writing style, helped him develop and edit him and critique his stuff in order to get him to a place where he was ready to write and publish. Unfortunately, his first work was published a couple of years after Lovecraft died in the mid-30s. Lovecraft never got a chance to see Fritz Leiber's first published work, which is Tucson Adventure. It's published for a magazine in the pulp era, and it's very pulpish and such. In that, Fritz Leiber wanted to sort of create some characters that were more true to life, and Fritz Leiber actually does that throughout his entire career. For example, he'll write against whatever's popular at the time if he doesn't like what that points are. For example, after Isaac Asimov's famous stuff comes out on robots, with the 3 laws of robots and stuff, he's like, oh, this isn't, I don't think this is how it would actually be. He actually writes a very famous work against a novel and such, and then he actually wins an award. It's an award-winning novel, and he regularly does that. He will write against what's popular at the time. Well, what was popular at the time were these giant sort of epic heroes that are very much a part of the pulp era. The pulp hero is sort of this hero that has that is not wearing cast out of shades of gray, but is clearly the person wearing the white hat. They are larger than life. They're characters like Tarzan, Conan, and many other characters out there too. Everybody from, you know, the masked guy with Tornado over on, whose name I can't remember off the top of my head, as well as in the Western genres, as well as many other major mythic characters, such as Solomon Kane, John Carter of Mars. I mean, there's just a big number of these giant heroes that are bigger than life-sized, and he definitely will sort of join it and such, and do a good job with that. And so he doesn't like that sort of concepts, and so he's creating these sort of 2 characters that are designed to be more realistic, and thus even though the first story is published during the pulp era, it still feels a little less pulpish, a little more modern. Because of that style and such. So that's good, and that's something he's going to continue throughout his career. He's going to typically push up against other people, write against what's popular if he doesn't think it's ill-conceived and such. Otherwise, he'll actually sometimes write with what's popular if he thinks it's well-intentioned and good and such. But he definitely has his own voice when he writes. So Tucson Adventure is published in 1939. in a magazine. So I have, so all the Lankhmar stories, it's actually, mine is actually in this collection, which is from the early 2000s. It was put out there. Now I have every single short story that was written. He started writing, like I said, in '39. He didn't stop writing until he passed away in the early 90s. So there are more than 50 years of Lankhmar short stories. Most of his Lankhmar short stories that star the characters of Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser are stories that take place in the city of Lankhmar or on the planet of Noan. So you'll take a look at those. There are various characters that are involved with them too that they'll interact with. Both of them are thieves, and they're going to feel like thieves. And in fact, I would say that Dungeons & Dragons probably feels more thievish than the other ones by far. But these 4 books, that's it. You could get the entire series of like 50 years of short stories in just those 4 books. So it's not the hardest series to read from beginning to end. Now, you can, based on who published it and when, there are different publication orders. The series that I have right now publishes them, not in their chronological publication order, but in the order of so the first story will introduce the characters in order and such. So they're in chronological order of the series. You know, lots of writers at the time would write characters out of order. Robert E. Howard, for example, his Conan stories were published out of order too. You would have, you know, a Conan the King story, and then you would have one of his youth stories, and so on and so forth. They'd be all mixed up and jumbled together. So you got a chance to kind of see who he was throughout his life. And this is not uncommon. Today, you would be very difficult to publish things not in chronological order. You might do a prelude because you like the character and go back and take a look at them, but you're typically just going to continue to publish your books in chronological order. You're not going to have a major character and just pop all over that person's life. Like Dristo Erden by R.A. Salvatore, yeah, he has a popular character, so he goes in the first trilogy is in chronological order, so he goes back and does a prelude trilogy. But then after doing the prelude trilogy, he just picks up where the first trilogy had left off, and he keeps going forward. He's not going to pop all over Dritz's life. He's not going to be, okay, here's Dritz as a teen. Okay, here's Dritz as an old man. All right, now let's come back to the modern time. He's not going to do that. But that was very popular during the pulp era. And it's also important to remember that during this era, you might not even read all of these stories, right? It's very possible that, stories would have been published in different magazines. If a magazine refused a sale, you would still try to sell it somewhere else. So you may end up having a lot of these characters, particularly Grey Mouser and Fafhrd, were published in different magazines over the course of that 50-year period. So you may not even get them all. So you may not even get them until like publication later in a collection or something. So we'll take a look in this book, Tucson Adventure, which is reprinted as The Jewels in the Forest. It's about 40 pages long. This is a novel-sized book. It's probably going to take probably a little bit more than an hour to read it. Especially once you get used to Fritz Leiber's style. If it's the first time you've read a Leiber story, it might take you a little bit longer, and such. But Fritz Leiber's storytelling definitely has a lot to recommend it. Now, Fritz Leiber is, when he's writing a story, he's definitely somebody who is self-aware. He writes a lot of comedy. He writes a lot of comical situations. There are stories of his that when I go back and reread them, I'm still laughing, even though I've read the story like 4 or 5 times. They're just incredibly good and incredibly well done. So it's important to understand that when you go into a Leiber story, pretty much anything other than his horror is going to tend to be have this sort of a comedic, self-aware tone to it. That has a lot of sort of situations that are designed to be funny, characters are doing funny things, and so forth. So it's important to kind of understand that when you go into a Fritz Leiber story, he doesn't take himself too seriously. Again, with the exception of his horror stuff, which does. His horror stuff does take himself very seriously. And he's actually considered, again, one of the masters of horror and short stories. He's won horror awards, like the Stoker Award for Best Horror. He's actually won lots of Hugo Awards. For example, his first Hugo was in 1958 when he wrote a novel called The Big Time that won the best Hugo novel in science fiction that year. He's also, even many of the short stories in the Fafhrd and Grey Mouser series have actually won awards too, like that, like the Hugos and Nebulas and stuff, for short form, for short stories or novellas and stuff like that. So he is definitely somebody who's won a lot of awards. He's one of the most award-winning writers in these genres, and because he wrote in all 3 genres, he's actually the perfect writer for this channel. Because again, one of the things I'm trying to do for you is try to unpack all of these lost classics of fantasy, science fiction, and horror. And since Fritz Leiber wrote all 3 of those genres, he's actually one of the, and he won awards in all 3 of them too. He's actually somebody I really like. He's not one of my top 10 writers, He's probably one of my next 10, but he's definitely a strong writer who's done a lot of different things and has a lot of different voices during his time as a writer. He did have some drug problems, and so he was regularly dealing with poverty. As a result, he never had a whole lot of money. You might know him because his stuff was optioned in Dungeons and Dragons. In the mid-80s, there was a number of modules and expansions and so forth set in the world that he had created with the Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser world of Lankhmar and such. So, and Lankhmar is certainly, I would argue, probably one of the most famous cities, if not the most famous city in fantasy fiction. And his characters, again, are very down to earth. He creates the sort of thieves. They're members of thieves guilds, what thieves do, how they interact with each other. Fafhrd is definitely somebody who definitely pretends like he really cares a lot about people, but he's very practical at times, and Grey Mouser is the exact opposite. He pretends like he doesn't care about people at all, and that they're just disposable, and then winds up being sometimes very surprisingly caring to others. So they have kind of this interest. One talks about being caring and ends up being more practical, one talks about being more practical and ends up being more caring. So they're kind of an interesting combination. They have very different skill sets. One's a 7-foot-tall giant barbarian, whereas the other's like barely a 5-foot-tall guy. So they have very different skill sets, different contexts, they fight differently, and have different personalities. So they're very interesting as a duo. And so again, and they have a lot of flaws. They will spend their time, you know, spending money, throwing it around bars. They'll engage in prostitution and so forth. And they're going to do that here too, in the first story, and so forth. So again, I don't want to give you too many sort of issues with the story itself. I don't want to give you too many spoilers for the first story, but did get a little bit of editing after it was first published, which makes sense. It's the first story you wrote, and it has been since when it's been published in later collections. It's now The Jewels in the Forest. So if you see The Jewels in the Forest in a collection, you'll know that's the first story. Not only the Fritz Leiber wrote, but the first one in the Fafhrd and Grey Mouser series as well. So have you read it? What you should think about it? Let me know in the comments below. If you've never heard of the series or the story or something like that, it's not a bad place to get started. Although if you're going to pick up one of these collections, I would probably just do them in chronological order. This one, for example, has it like the 8th or 9th story in there. You can just go ahead and start because, again, that chronological order is basically how we tend to read today as readers. So it kind of helps, I think, to read them in that order. Although there'll be some consistency because you'll be reading a story that was written like 30 years into his career, and then like one of his first stories he ever wrote. And obviously, you know, after you've been doing something for 30 years, you're going to be a whole lot better at it than you were. So you're going to have these sort of things if you read them in chronological order. But I think you just, as long as you go into it with kind of an eyes wide open, you'll be fine. I'll link you to some of the collections to that below too, so you can check them out. But what did you think? Let me know. I'd be happy to engage you further about the story, the characters, the world, and so forth. I'm happy to talk with you about that more. If you've never thought of it, again, check it out. And hey, if you took some time out of your day to spend with this review of that story, hey, I really appreciate it. I appreciate this took time out of your day. We all have busy days and busy lives, so thank you for that. Also, if you enjoyed this, there's no reason not to hit that subscribe button because there's going to be so many more videos to follow. Once again, thank you so much for your time.